friends, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you on this Rosh Hashanah day. It is always an honor to do so. As many of you are aware, my daughter Leora lives in a suburb of Tel Aviv. This summer, Jane and I were blessed with another Israeli grandchild, whose name is Shaya. We spent 2.5 weeks in Israel. Because of good timing, Leora gave birth 2 days after we arrived, and even better timing for Shaya, it happened to be on Jane's birthday, so it was a great birthday present. Jerusalem is the city founded by King David, really the center of historic Judaism, and it is where the temple in the Jerusalem was built, and being there is an intoxicating experience. But Tel Aviv is, for me, the real Israel, the modern Israel. This city is the cultural and economic pulse of Israel, the inclusive Israel, the cosmopolitan Israel. It is where the independence of Israel was declared. It is where Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great Hebrew poet, and other literary figures created modern Hebrew language and literature. My favorite street in Tel Aviv is Bugrashov, a street that runs diagonally from Tel Aviv Beach to Dizengoff Square, an important Tel Aviv commercial hub. Here is what is amazing about Bugrashov. More French is spoken there than Hebrew. There are beautiful Parisian-style cafes, wine stores and cheese stores, stylish women clothing stores, French signs everywhere, and people walking the street, often Orthodox, but with a Parisian style and flair. Now, what is going on here in the middle of Tel Aviv? A significant number of French Jews have come to Tel Aviv because France has become a difficult place for Jews to live. There is a lot of overt and covert anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence. At least 33,000 French Jews have immigrated since 2013. Many French Jews doubt their future in France. Beyond loving the Jewish Parisian flair of this street, this French Jewish enclave clarifies for me what Israel is about. The Jews need a place to go when there is no place else for them. Robert Frost said it so beautifully. He is asked, "What is home?" And he answers, "Where when you have to go there, they have to take you in." Where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. The contemporary experience of this French Jewish immigration connects us directly with the history of Zionism, the commitment to the creation of a Jewish homeland and eventually a Jewish state. The Zionist movement arose in part as a reaction to French anti-Semitism in the 19th century, not the 21st century. Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism, was a Vietnamese playwright and journalist and became the Paris correspondent of an influential liberal Vienna newspaper. In France, he confronted profound anti-Semitism, and then it came to a head. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was unjustly accused of treason, mainly because of prevailing anti-Semitic atmosphere. Herzl witnessed mobs shouting, "Death to the Jews." He resolved that there was only one solution to this anti-Semitic assault: the mass immigration of Jews to a land that they could call their own. Herzl concluded that anti-Semitism would never disappear even if the Jews assimilated. And he wrote the famous book, The Jewish State, in 1896, This book describes his vision of a sovereign Jewish nation to be created in the 20th century. Herzl convened and chaired the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland on August 29 through 31st, 1897. The Zionist movement was born. The Jews of France on Bougashov Street and the vision of Theodor Herzl, which preceded it, explains what is at stake in Israel. The Zionist statement is that the Jewish people will no longer be pushed around and be vulnerable and not able to defend themselves. They will not meet the fate of Jews in history, wandering Jews, insecure guests wherever they dwelt. Zionism is the affirmation that the Jews have an absolute right to create an independent state where they can be free, where they can renew their spiritual and cultural life, where they can reconnect to the land itself, where Jews will always be welcome, no questions asked. The seed of this idea was promised by God to the Jews through Abraham. And I quote, "The Lord said to Avram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." We dare not forget the intention of the state of Israel. What the founders of Israel declared in Independence Hall in Tel Aviv on May 14th, 1948, in the Israelis' Declaration of Independence, which includes this statement. And I pray, listen to this statement carefully. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions. This is Israel. This is Zionism. This is what Israel seeks to be. We sometimes forget why Israel exists and must exist, and what threatens its existence. We forget the hope. We forget the dream. The dream is so fragile, even confusing. And it is urgent, I believe, on Rosh Hashanah to clarify how Israel connects to our Jewish present, how it connects to you and me. And like everything Jewish, it is complicated. And the last several months have been extremely complicated and complex. From May 10th through 21st, 2021, Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Israel fought a war. It shook us. My daughter, and I spoke about this once on Shabbat several months ago, my daughter's family had to sleep in a safe room every night as the Iron Dome defense system shot down incoming missiles over Tel Aviv. There were a series of events preceding the conflict, ongoing tension which reflect unresolved issues between Palestinians and Israelis within Israel, which need to be addressed. They are serious. No one in Israel denies that. But that unresolved issue or issues became a perverse excuse, and I underline perverse, for Hamas and other Palestinian militants to fire more than 4,000 rockets from Gaza Strip into Israel unprovoked. Nearly 250 Palestinians, including 66 children, were killed, and thousands were left injured or homeless in 11 days of fighting. 12 Israeli civilians, including 2 children and 1 Israeli soldier, were also killed. Any loss of life is horrific. But if Israel does not have the right to defend itself when attacked, we are in effect saying that it doesn't have a right to exist. Hamas's attack on Israel is based on its purpose. I decided to read in full the covenant of Hamas. It's not pleasant reading, but you should all read it. The first paragraph of the covenant is entitled, the first paragraph, quote, on the destruction of Israel, and I quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it just as it obliterated others before it, close quote. And when Israel defends itself, they are accused of war crimes, the use of disproportional force. I have a simple statement about proportionality. Hamas will fire no missiles at Israel, and Israel will not fire any missiles at Gaza. That is my definition of proportionality. Hamas has had no reluctance about deploying terrorist cells and weapons in civilian population center in Gaza, fully aware that Israel has no choice but to appear to be targeting innocent people. Israel goes to unprecedented lengths to avoid falling into Hamas's trap, even having phoned and dropped leaflets in advance to warn civilians to leave targeted areas. That's not a fact you will hear on CNN or read in the New York Times. American progressives are forsaking Israel. One example, the most progressive members of Israel are Israel bashers. U.S. Representative Omar accused Israel of committing acts of terrorism. U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez accused Israel of being, and I quote, an apartheid state. This label of apartheid is a code word for dismantling Israel. Can we talk about the facts? The idea that Israel is an apartheid state is an obscenity. Israel gives more rights to its Arab citizens than most of its Arab neighbors give to its own citizens. Arabs in Israel have equal voting rights and is one of the few places in the Middle East where Arab women may vote. Arab citizens have political parties, hold seats in the Knesset, an Arab judge sits on the Supreme Court, and many hold various government posts. And the new coalition government is held together by the Muslim Arab Party. Stop lying about Israel. When Arab children need special medical care, even children from Gaza, they receive it in Israeli hospitals. That's not apartheid. And here is what's growing, is a growing fear of mine. What has happened to American Jewish support for Israel, especially among millennials in the Generation Z? The Pew Jewish Population Study shows that American Jewish support for Israel is weakening as each generation goes by. Overall, younger American Jews are less attached to Israel than older generations. About half of Jewish adults under 30 describe themselves as emotionally connected to Israel, compared to 2/3 of Jews over the age of 64. I understand what's happening. These young Jews, and I'm proud of them, are committed, because of their Judaism, to issues of social justice, the fight for women's rights, the struggle against racism in our country. They believe that Israel does not reflect their values, and I admire their commitment to the universal struggle for a just society. Yet I worry about their rhetoric and their distorted perspective. It often sounds as if they question whether Zionism is even proper and whether Israel even has a right to exist. To be a Jew is to care about the suffering of all people, but it is one-sided to acknowledge the plight of the Palestinians and fail to appreciate Israel's anxieties, such as the suffering of Israelis and their concern about terrorism, the brutal nature of Hamas's terrorist regime. Their philosophy is practically identical to the Taliban. Recognizing that Hamas is a tool for the Iranian genocidal intentions against Israel. The challenges of creating a Palestinian state. With whom do you negotiate in that process? The Palestinian Authority is filled with corruption and anti-democratic values. There has not been a free election for the Palestinian parliament since 2006. And if there is a Palestinian state, which I hope there is someday, how can it be assured that it will remain demilitarized? Please don't misunderstand me. I am not an apologist for Israel. I am not a propagandist. I'm concerned about the plight of Palestinians, but it's more complicated than it's often reported. For example, people fail to acknowledge that about 750,000 Jews who had lived in surrounding Arab and Muslim lands for centuries were forced to leave their home and to flee to Israel when Israel was declared in 1948. Where is the concern for that injustice? You never hear about that. I'm concerned about the tone of Israeli politics. I'm concerned about the increasing gap between the rich and the poor in Israel. I'm concerned about the power of the ultra-Orthodox to impose their values and ways on Israeli society. I'm a Reformed Jew. I want non-Orthodox Judaism to exist in Israel, and the ultra-Orthodox make that very difficult. I'm concerned about religious nationalists who cannot conceive of territorial compromise, which must happen if there is ever any resolution of the conflict. I'm concerned about settlements on the West Bank. Do they make peace impossible? No, but that's a concern. But hear this. I express my concern because Israel matters to me, because its survival is essential, and because I am a Jew. So where are we at this moment? What should be our relationship with Israel? What do I suggest? First, an appreciation for our people's history. To remember why Zionism is so essential to Judaism, to remember why Israel matters. The state of Israel is necessary, and for those who doubt the right of Israel to exist, my question is, where do the Jews go when they're at risk and there is no state? Antarctica? Afghanistan? Missouri? Hungary? France? Tell me where the Jews are supposed to go when people who want this will dismantle Israel. Second, we need Ahavat Yisrael, the love of the Jewish people. The majority of Jews live in Israel now, over 8 million Jews. They represent the vitality and diversity of the Jewish people. They are our family. American Jews who express hostility towards Israel because it is not perfect or their ideal of a democracy will solve nothing. Love and support, empathy, and loving perspective go a long way. Third, let us embrace Israel for what it has accomplished. I'm not just speaking about its economic accomplishments and its military strength and its wonderful 5-star hotels. Israel is a work in progress. The level of idealism and dedication to the perfection of society is remarkable. There exists more than 15,000 active non-governmental organizations in Israel, mostly apolitical, which promote universal moral values, human rights, democracy, civil society, and environment. For example, here's something you probably haven't heard of. Yad B'Yad. Hand in hand is building inclusion and equality between Arab and Jewish citizens of Israel through a growing network of bilingual integrated schools and communities. Launched in 1997 with 50 children, Hand in Hand, Yad B'Yad now enrolls over 2,000 students in 7 schools from Jerusalem to the Galilee. Hand in Hand was established to combat one of Israel's greatest existential threats, the growing social alienation and lack of trust between Jewish and Arab citizens in Israel. My daughter and son-in-law have explored sending our granddaughter to such a school. They want their children to speak Arabic along with English and Hebrew and make friends among the Israeli Arab community. That's how healing will take place. Work to heal the problem, not pontification about the problem. Fourth, read a book about Israel. I recommend Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn by Rabbi Daniel Gordis, who I went to rabbinical school with. It's a National Jewish Book Award recipient. It is a short but quite enlightening history of Israel. We need to know Israel and not to know it falsely through how other people explain it. Fifth, visit Israel after COVID-19. Revisit it, understand it, feel it, taste it, explore it, talk to the people, argue with the cab drivers, play golf in Caesarea, go into a supermarket, go scuba diving in a lot, hike in the Golan Heights, visit the West Bank and see the security wall, and talk to Palestinians. Attend a Reform synagogue for worship on a Friday night. Even get angry with it, but do it with an open eyes and a loving heart. 6, connect with a Zionist organization. I recommend, because I'm a member, the Association of Reformed Zionists of America, which works for religious equality and social justice for all Israeli citizens, Arab and Jews alike. And by becoming formally a Reformed Zionist, we stop being critics and begin to be partners, and join a Reformed synagogue in Israel for $360. I can tell you some of them to join. They need the money. Why am I so passionate about this? And why is this so important? Because it's about the survival of the Jewish people, and I've spent my whole life working for that survival. What holds us together is not our religion. It is a sense of Jewish peoplehood. The Jews are one nation, one people, linked together by fate and by history. The Talmud states unequivocally, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, meaning all of Israel are responsible for each other. The future of all that we love as loyal Jews is linked with this miraculous, challenging, complex, imperfect, diverse, frustrating, idealistic, compassionate, emotional, beautiful Jewish country. It's called Israel. Boy, do I love it for what it is. I hope that you can find that affection as well. Am Yisrael Chai. Let the Jewish people live in peace and security in their nation, with friendship, respect, and partnership with all the nations and peoples of the world. Let me close with this prayer for the state of Israel. It is written, I will establish a home for my people Israel and will plant them firm, so that they shall dwell secure and shall tremble no more. I will give you safety from your enemies. Source of our people's liberation, whose home is the human heart, give strength and shelter to the state of Israel and its people, and to Zionists and Zion's friends in all countries. With love, nourish the saplings of the land and preserve its old growth. Bless the seeds of democracy planted by courageous pioneers. Bring to flower a good society rooted in history and hope, made holy by its unceasing pursuit of justice, made strong by its vision of equality and human dignity. Let sweetness overwhelm sorrow, joy overwhelm despair. Rock and Redeemer, may the words of the prophets be fulfilled. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Source of peace, we pray for an oasis of peace, a home secure and safe, a wellspring of shalom for Israel, its neighbors, and all people. And let us all say, Amen.